It's time for a little Funky Friday. From their funky hidden headquarters, your hosts, Keith and Gerry.
More like Sunday. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Pop Culture Minefield. This is our special Blade Runner edition that we're going to be ongoing. And our first guest for our Blade Runner discussion group is none other than this guy named Paul Sammon. I don't know what he's done. It's somehow involved with Blade Runner. And, of course, our panel is here, Iain, T-shirt, and Grim. And all of us are huge Blade Runner fans. Iain, of course, is the guy that's in charge of the Blade Runner group on Facebook, which he very kindly said was inspired by us. And we, Blade Zone, were inspired by none other than you, Paul. I read your book and I said, I better put this online.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's, you know, what you see over my shoulder there is the first edition cover, which came out in '96, and there are 3 editions now. So.
Yep. And one of those I'm in with Gerry.
Oh, absolutely. Hang on. I just happen to have a copy of the latest version here.
Whoa!
That's the one that came out in 2017.
That's thick.
Yeah, as a tie-in
it's
to
the,
Blade Runner 2049.
We would refer to that as the expurgated version without Blade Zone in it.
Oh, Blade Zone's in here. Blade Zone's
Oh, are we? Okay, good.
Oh, absolutely.
I gotta get that.
I'm not in there.
Next edition.
Next edition. It's so fascinating because, you know, Gerry, because you know Gerry as well as I do. Gerry and I joked back in 1997, and I'm going to do my impression of Gerry. You've talked to him, so you know how he sounds.
I do.
You know, Gerry, I wonder if we're going to make it to 2019. Wouldn't that be nice?
Well, you know, after 2020, we barely made it through that, so we might not have been too far off.
I'm still amazed that Blade Zone is still going strong.
Oh, I
know.
And you know, the website, you guys do a great job. Since today is a special day, let me give a shout out to Jermaine Plunkett, who is, it's her birthday,
Amen.
and she has got a wonderful, you know, Blade Runner art sort of ongoing exhibit of her own. Just marvelous stuff out there.
Amen. And we tried to get Jermaine to come on here. She was like, "Oh, get Iain." And I'm like, "Iain, but I can't stand that guy." All right, I'll ask him.
My wife says that too.
Yep. So let's get at it, guys. Let's ask Paul some questions about Blade Runner. Don't forget, he's covered Starship Troopers, and he knows my boss, Dale Dye.
I worked with the first movie I worked with Captain Dye on, believe it or not, was Platoon.
Oh, wow.
Was what?
Platoon.
Oh, wait. What did you do on Platoon? I don't remember you being involved.
You see, I'm one of those people that, unfortunately, we live in a very specialized age. And some people know me for instance, Conan the Phenomenon, which is this book I did for Dark Horse about the Conan character for 70 years. And I was first familiar with Conan in 1960. I've done things on horror. I've done things with Elvis Presley. I've done rock and roll books where I actually got Lou Reed to write an original essay for me. So I've been all over the place. But I've worked on mainstream films and a lot of genre films. But Orion Pictures, where I was working in the mid-'80s, was the company responsible for Platoon. And that was shot in the Philippines. And providentially or not, I was raised in the Philippines. I was in a military family. I was at Subic Bay, Sangley Point, Clark Air Force Base. And I happened to be a junior vice president of publicity at Orion, and Platoon was on, and I said, hey, this was sort of at the dawn of like EPKs and featurettes and stuff, mid-'80s. And I said, if you give me some footage of somebody shoots some stuff, I'll put a featurette together for you. And they said, well, why don't you go to the Philippines? So I was, for a few days, I was there at the boot camp. I'm sure Captain Dye didn't remember me because about 11 years later, when I was working on Starship Troopers, by the way, which I'm in, I'm the guy who pushes.
Oh yeah, I know. Yeah,
I'm the guy who pushes the cow into the warrior pen, and the warrior part jumps on it, and you see me run out. My 10 seconds, literally a thing. But just very fortunate. But anyway, Platoon, yeah, it was the first time I met Captain Dye. He's a real character.
Paul, I want your number after the show because everything you named off before is all shit that I love. So I definitely would love to hang out with you.
All right. Well,
I got to tell you, Dale Dye is one of the few people on this planet. My own dad, my priest, and my senior leading officer, my executive officer in the Army, that can make my ass clench when they call me son.
Captain Dye was so funny. I mean, he's got a great sense of humor, too. I know we're supposed to be talking about Blade Runner, but a very quick Starship Troopers story. I was originally I had worked on RoboCop 2 with the producer John Davison as the CG supervisor, and also did 2 other on-location jobs. I was in with them in Houston for 8 months, and so when Starship Troopers came up, I was offered early on a job as sort of a general CG supervisor again, but then Sony Pictures had this new company called ImageWorks, which was an in-house effects group, so I lost that job. And they said, well, look, we like working with you. What do you want to do? I said, I don't know. What do you want me to do? And I'd worked with Paul Verhoeven on RoboCop and John, and that was one of my pictures, quote unquote, at Orion as well. They said, well, why don't you write a book about the making of Starship Troopers? And I said, fine. You want to give me total access like I had before on Blade Runner? They said, sure. So I was with them for about a year and a half. And anyway, if you'll remember the invasion of Klendathu, when you have the drop ships that look like the old World War II landing craft, the LSTs, where, the front ramp comes and they all run out. And if you'll notice, there's all kinds of plasma explosions going off and all these. That's actually based on footage from the Normandy invasion that Paul Verhoeven found.
I always suspected that.
Captain Dye took umbrage with that. He said, that's the goddamnest worst military maneuver I ever saw. I would never ever say it. And I remember him going off because he and Paul was in the Royal Dutch Marines, and so he had military experience as well. But it was funny because Captain Dye went on and on and on, and Paul just stared at him and said, "Would you like to see the footage? The original footage? The original footage?" And that was one of the few times that I saw Captain Dye just kind of go. But I liked him. He's very good at what he does, and he's a very interesting guy.
Well, if we're gonna talk Blade Runner, I definitely the first thing I want to mention about it is even though Neuromancer is probably credited with the birth of cyberpunk as far as a literature genre, Blade Runner, the visual of Blade Runner is the look that all cyberpunk has since tried to copy or ape or otherwise emulate, I would say.
Yes. Oh, I know, endlessly. This is caffeine, okay? Just so you don't think I'm going to do an episode of Drunk History here. Yeah, no.
Poor Iain is.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, poor Ian's up. It's like 1 o'clock in the morning there in Scotland.
Oh yeah. Well, it's early, right?
Yeah.
Well, one thing I learned is sun never totally set in Scotland.
I love Scotland. The UK. I mean, I've been to Wales. I'm Irish. I'm 4th generation Irish. And sorry, Iain, but I've been to Scotland. I've been to England. I've been to Wales. I've been to Ireland. I was just in Ireland. I was there on Halloween 2019, which was quite an experience. I didn't realize the Irish tried to burn down half of Dublin on Halloween, but there you go.
Well, you know the old saying, Paul. a Scotsman is only, is an Irishman that just never learned to swim.
Well,
can
I've
I
heard
say-
other sayings too, but I won't put them out there in the site.
Never-
But no, that
never
question
apologize for
you
being a
asked
Celt,
about,
so.
William Gibson. I met Bill Gibson a couple of times, and
wow.
as I say in Future Noir on my book, Bill was in the process of writing Neuromancer when he saw Blade Runner, and he was totally devastated by it because he said, "Fuck, can I say
Yeah.
Yeah,
fungo?
say whatever you want.
Fungo, these people beat me to it."
He walked out of the cinema, didn't he, Paul?
Yes, and he's very interesting guy. He's tall, he's thin, he's very professorial looking. Obviously, whip smart. But what was interesting when he and I met was that as an early adopter of home computers, there's a thing called the Timex Sinclair that I started working with in the early '80s.
I remember
And
this.
so I've been working with computers since honestly the earliest iterations of home usage, and so he was too. And so we were one of the few people at that period of time that could talk to each other about our excitement, Apple IIs and Commodore 64s and 128. But years later, when I saw him after Blade Runner, and I said, "Are you still angry?" And he goes, "No." He says, "The literary world knows me because of Neuromancer and my other books." And that did what I wanted it to. But he said, "Damn, I wish I had gotten that out sooner." That's a direct quote.
Wow. Dang. William Gibson.
We were talking before the show, before you were able to get on, and thank God we got it figured out how to get you on here.
I was very.
We were talking about the posters because when the final cut was finally happening, I introduced Charlie to Drew,
right,
because I wanted that poster to happen because I knew John before he passed away. And
sure.
I've always liked his artwork, but I was angry that Drew's wasn't the one that was on there, even though they used it without rights.
Right.
Because as you recall, the first novelization got released with Drew's artwork on the cover.
I do recall that.
And it was also on the back of the Souvenir magazine.
Yep.
And now they had the right to put it on the back of the magazine. But all it was, as I recall, Drew told me this, it was a comp. It was not the finished artwork. And he had done like 2 or 3 versions of the poster, and that seemed to be the one they wanted, and then they never paid him for the final artwork.
That sounds very much like Hollywood.
Yeah. And so they printed it, and then somebody, I'm not saying it was Drew, but it was most likely Drew, that called them and said, "You didn't pay for that. You can't publish that cover." So they pulled that cover off. So I have the original with Drew's artwork on it. That was the first version I got.
Right.
And then they released the version with a photograph, and the other one was with John Alvin's artwork.
Right.
And then there's the whole John Alvin artwork, which is the way he explained it to me was that he didn't really finish the artwork. He got paid, but that wasn't the artwork he wanted to do. And was it 2011 when he did the anniversary edition?
Yes.
What year was it? 2011?
I think it was
2007.
uh,
No, it was 2011.
2007. I think it might have been.
I think you're both right, Ian. You said it the first time. It was 07. And he went and updated the artwork to the kind of artwork that he puts out, because he's a very good artist.
Of course.
And so we finally got to see what that poster probably would have looked like if he'd gotten to finish it. Because when you look at that poster, really look at it, it's a really nice composition piece, but it is not finished.
Yeah.
You can look at it and tell that's not your standard John Alvin finished artwork.
Right.
And but either way it goes, stunning artwork for both of them. And of course,
I've met spoke with John before he passed a number of times, and I've actually met Drew a few times. And I have a very nice picture of Drew and I and Joanna Cassidy where we did a signing at a bookstore in L.A. And Joe is, I'm happy to say, is one of my dearest and closest friends. And I say that without any Hollywood smear on top of that.
Right.
Joanna and I first met, and it's a how can I put this? It's like a genuine, deep friendship. And I first met her, and we clicked. And I've been married for 46 years to the same woman, and I'm very fortunate in that respect. And the three of us just get along. And I've always very much admired Joanna, and she's a very sophisticated, very talented woman, and she's a great friend. But I know that when Drew was there, it was very funny because it was the first time he had met her, and he was kind of, because Joanna is still striking. And I should
She is.
I really should edit out that still, because boy, that opens me up. Joanna is striking, and so I in fact at one point there was a collection of Drew's work that was done by a friend of mine, Jesse, and they wanted me to do one of the intros, but because of internal politics, I wasn't able to do that. So I'm very familiar with Drew's, commercial art and his poster art, Albin's art, and you have to understand about me as a person. I'm not one of these people that came in. I got into the back. I don't ever have understood how I really wound up working in Hollywood for 40 years, because I'm not only someone who wrote about it, but I was, in the business. I mean, deep in the business for probably 35 years. I was a studio executive, a special effects guy, an actor, writer, producer. I, produced 3 years worth of Japanese TV shows, hundreds of episodes. I was a co-writer and the co-producer of the first jointly animated Soviet-American animated film back in 1988. I was on location in Moscow, Soviet smoke film, so I've been all over the place. But I just was so fortunate to, although I did do some work in the 70s, to really kind of hit my stride in the 80s. And I was there when all this stuff was happening, The Thing, Conan the Barbarian, Poltergeist, Ghostbusters. God, the list goes on and on and on. And a lot of the films that became iconic, I was either literally working on, or for the time that I was trying to juggle being both a journalist and a historian, and also someone who was working within the system. I cocooned, I got to meet the whole cast and crew, went on location with them. Evil Dead 2 was one of my movies when I worked at the De Laurentiis Entertainment Group, and Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell in this place in Wilmington, North Carolina, and their production headquarters was the house that they built for The Color Purple, which was still out there in the middle of nowhere. I mean, I've got billions of stories, but I keep coming back to Blade Runner because in many respects, it still remains such a unique, not only finished product, but the actual process was so complex and so difficult for so many people. I'm often asked, what are, Paul, the people that know me that I was in the business, there's kind of a common question sometimes. We go, oh, what's the worst movie you ever worked on? Or what was the most difficult? And I always say the most bloodied film I watched being made was Blade Runner. And the most personally challenging and sort of innocence-stripping production that I was heavily involved in was David Lynch's 1984 Dune, which I was also involved in, and indeed did a featurette on called Destination Dune, which you can find online. And it's coming out in narrow video, by the way, as a special edition DVD Blu-ray that I'm doing. Yeah, I did a commentary, and for the first time, I'm pretty candid about what went on. David Lynch is a marvelous guy. I have zero negativity towards David. I love David. And strangely enough, right after that, I'm in another studio and I'm working on Blue Velvet with David. So David is aces, as he would say. But Dune.
Strange, you and I have connections that way because Ron Miller was one of my first art teachers,
right.
and he was a production artist on Dune.
Oh, I know. Ron and
him and Judy
down there in Mexico.
Yeah, Judy.
Yes.
I was at their house at the time. I lived at their house with them, and it was a phenomenal experience. And then later, I got to be a +1 at dinner with David Lynch. But right before we go in, Ron turns to me and says, "And you can't talk about Dune." And I'm like,
David,
why the fuck am I here?
You know, it's interesting. Dune bloodied a lot of people. It wasn't just David. Dune was a very psychologically, professionally, physically, it was tough. That was a really tough production. And plus, you know, there were sound stages being blown up during that. The official line was that there was a sound stage at Turbo Studios that was housing old nitrate films, and they caught fire and they blew up. But the rumors were it was somewhat connected to crime, and it was sort of a warning to productions. Now that's just a rumor. So, you know, I mean, that was... De Laurentiis
has skirted the mafia in the past. I was just reading about it.
I can't speak to that. I can speak to the fact that I worked for DEG, De Laurentiis Entertainment Group, and I was with them for 2 years. And when I was on Conan the Barbarian, I sort of came in as a journalist, even though I was already working at other studios. But then about halfway through post-production, they hired me. And Universal hired me to be like one of the proto-genre marketers, going to places like the nascent, you know, Comic-Con and in San Diego and all over the place. Samuel Bergman and I remember, did this massive public appearance at the Space Needle in Seattle in '82. And I have a photo somewhere where literally...
I'd love to see that. I love Samuel Bergman.
Oh, yeah, it's cool. But anyway, long story short, Dino was an interesting guy. And, you know, if you look at his CV, it's everything from Fellini to, you know, people who once had a real upward career arc and then were, you know, but on the other hand, I remember I was working at the same time on Dune with Conan the Destroyer, because they were shooting in the same sound stages with the same producer at the same time, and sitting with Richard Fleischer for day after day after day and talking about everything but Conan. You know, talking about The Narrow Margin, talking about Max Fleischer, his father, Popeye cartoons, the Betty Boop cartoons, talking about movies like Crack in the Mirror, or, you know, what was the one? Can't remember now. The one where it's the Leopold Loeb murders that has Bradford Billman and Dean Stone. Yeah, but whatever. We're so far afield from the later right now.
I'm
we
talking about
only
rope.
have 11 minutes left, really? Or do we
No. We have more than that.
Oh, okay. You know, I felt so bad because I literally, for those of you who are listening, we had to go through 3 of my devices before it would finally hook up. And I could see everything. I just couldn't hear anything. So I'm going to do a big shout out to Apple iPad Pro, because that's what
I love the original Dune, unironically, so it was worth the pain.
Yeah,
it was an interesting show to watch, and you know, David, I felt, and this sounds, it's totally sincere, I felt very sad for him, because I think what happened was that, you know, that was only his 3rd feature, really. You know, and he did Eraserhead, he did The Elephant Man, he goes right to Dune, and you can see this real upward arc. And I think that David felt that he would have more artistic control, even though he had signed a contract that gave away a lot of that. And I think it was his first experience with a certain kind of hardball filmmaking. And as it slipped farther and farther away from what he really wanted to do, and there are tons of production problems, and it was, you know, I mean, he suffered on that movie. He was trying. If you would have read the original screenplay that David wrote alone, as a guy who read Dune in 1965 when it was in the Chilton hardcover, I knew Dune, and I'd been reading them, Children of Dune, Messiah of Dune. I was aware of all these. I'm a literate. I sound like bragging, but I'm kind of a polymath. I mean, I'm into music, movies, and books, and people. Those are, and adventures. I love to go out and get crazy. But in fact, I was just out hiking in the swamp before I got on here. I jumped in the shower and my eyes are probably a little red, and I wish I could say it's some good drugs, but nah. Just a shower.
I do have an actual Blade Runner related question.
Yes, please. God,
if I can have the temerity,
I'm very shy, and it's hard for me to talk. So. Sorry.
So Jim Burns, the artist, he's kind of an acquaintance of mine, sort of. And I know he did a lot of concept art. Everyone knows about the spinner and the blaster.
Right.
Apocryphally, I've heard the blaster was originally designed as a phone and then gradually got turned into the gun.
Sid Mead, who, sadly and ironically, along with Richter, passed in 2019, and Sid in Los Angeles passed. Very, very, very sad. In fact, Sid and I were actually quite good friends, and I used to go to his home in Pasadena. And I think it was in June of 2019, he had finally gotten out of the hospital, and the writing was on the wall, and he knew that they only had a few months, but he was just as upbeat and as welcoming and as warm as ever. And anyone who ever met Sid Mead, and there are a lot of people who did, know that he was the genuine article. He had no pretensions. He was a demon at work. And one of the things that appealed to Ridley was how fast Sid was. Sid was fast. And he would sit there and just, and you go,
Speed painting is what it's called, and I've seen him do it, and it's amazing.
But he's also very good at sketching, and also very, and Ridley, of course, the famous story in Blade Runner is that Ridley was constantly changing his mind in midstream. And his mind was moving so fast that they would get something locked in, and Ridley be a week ahead of them, design-wise. And so, yes, it's true. It's actually the vid phone, and it was and the blaster sort of intersected at one point. And there was an entirely different vid phone that was originally designed. There was an entirely different Voight Kampf machine that was designed. All those designs went through numerous iterations. And the blaster essentially finally came together during the recce, as the English call it, where Ivor Powell, the associate producer, and Ridley literally went and started to scour stores, gun shops and this type of thing, and cobbled together two pieces, actually three different kinds of weapons, and, right there. They kind of kludged it in real life. That's an old model making thing. But that's how it happened. And so, I was there constantly, and I'd come in the next day and I'd go, well, what happened to that? Billy changed his mind. We got to.
But I would say, Paul, that led to about 30 years of vagueness and controversy amongst fans and replica makers, because of course it was in your original manuscript, the details of how it was built, but then some guys had a stunt model to go off, one of the rubber stunt models to go off and try and retrofit it, and there's Takagi in Japan who managed to do some amazing work, Takagi-san.
Yes, I mean, it's been wonderful how there's been this continuation within the prop community and all the different online communities that have just. Well, Adam Savage is a huge blaster fan. I've got a good picture of Adam and I, by the way, today. And he's built one that just is marvelous. And Gene Winfield, the guy who did, of course, the building of the cars for Blade Runner, he's got a blaster. And so, they're out there. But one of the problems with, and one of the reasons why I did the book originally was because as someone who was there, within a period from the time it was released in 82 to the time I had my book published in 96, although it took me about 3 years to write the first edition, I kept hearing incorrect data. People were like, it was just like, where did you get that from? Totally incorrect stuff. And so, honestly, if you read, and this isn't self-aggrandizement because it's true, but if you read Future Noir, you are actually getting the real story. You are not hearing suppositions or people that have these theories or hypotheses. It's genuinely what happened. And it's not from me. It's from the horse's mouths. It's from the people who did the props, who did the wardrobes, who were the actors, who were the producers, who were the writers, the guys who did the makeup, the guys who didn't like Riddler, the guys that did like Riddler, the guys that didn't like Don Young, the guys that did like Sean. I mean, it's this epic cast of characters. And that was one of the great thrills for me to do that book. I've written over 30 books. And that particular one was, for better or worse, there's a phrase used to be called the new journalism that Tom Wolfe came up with in the 70s and 80s. Bonfire of the Vanities is probably a very famous example because it was made into such a terrible movie. But what Tom Wolfe did in doing the right stuff and things like that is he became an active character in his story, right? Tom Wolfe is in there as this guy who is his own character. I consciously, with Future Noir and that Blade Runner book, said, I'm not going to do that. I could quite easily, but I said no. I said, I am going to do this book for two reasons. One, to tell the story of what really happened during the making of Blade Runner and afterwards, and what preceded it with Phil Dick, who I knew as well. And then I wanted to give the general public and people who are more sophisticated in the behind-the-scenes mechanism of motion picture making a very focused look at what really goes on when a film is made, a major motion picture. And I did not do it with a snarky attitude or negative attitude. I tried to be balanced. Both sides of it, because everyone has two sides of the story. And as someone who's been involved now with over 100 productions in all kinds of different areas, it's still, unless it's, I guess it's kind of like being a man and saying, oh yeah, I understand what it's like to give birth. No. If you have not worked on a major film for a while or in the industry, you really have no idea. And so that I was trying to pull the curtain back a bit and say, this is how a movie gets made.
Well, you can say it's because of that you really earned two titles, certainly in the Blade Runner groups that I'm part of. First of all, you are the Blade Runner historian.
Thank you.
Because you did not, you put yourself front and center in that, and as you say, you could have. Instead, it is a pure history of the sequence of events, but also it is the Blade Runner Bible. And to this day, we still get so many of these false stories or these tropes that crop up every so often about one piece of crap or another that somebody heard, down the pub from their pal, who heard it from their hairdresser's dog, and it's garbage. And we always say to them, if you will refer to Future Noir, written by Paul Sammon, the amount of times that your name gets cited or tagged in, you must hate us by now.
Oh, no. In fact, again, this may sound false, but it's not. I am so grateful for not only the fact that the film has endured as it should, but my little effort to be the, Boswell to Dr. Johnson has endured. And to be called the Blade Runner Bible to me is a great honor. it's funny though, because
we've all called it that, Paul. You know that.
No, I know, but I'm thanking you. I mean, sincerely.
Because it is the Blade Runner Bible.
I know. It's a great, and I didn't come up with it. That was a great.
Yeah, but that does make you a Blade Runner saint.
Well, you know what they say about idols with feet of clay, so be careful.
Yeah.
That was something I learned early on, because I had so many idols in the film and literature and music business, and I met quite a few of them, and it was kind of like, some of them lived up. For instance, I'll just throw a name out: Robert Bloch, the man who wrote Psycho. Robert Bloch was a sweetheart. He was one of the most professional and yet just loving, kind, hilarious guy. He started writing jokes. That's how he got his start for vaudevillian comics. And he started as a comedian, and he wound up writing Psycho. But he was wonderful. Other people were quite more complicated. Harlan Ellison was always one of my friends, but Harlan and I had our ups and downs, as everyone did with Harlan.
Man, Harlan, I don't think he had anybody in his life he didn't have a rough patch with.
That's what I like about him.
Harlan was a complicated man, and when we first met, which was in the mid 1970s, and I was in my 20s, I of course was starstruck with, and as that transpired, the late 60s through the late 70s were his golden years. And I had seen things like the Outer Limits episodes that he had written, like Soldier and Demon with a Glass Hand, which still holds up quite well.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
But I'd also read Dangerous Visions and The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World, and on and on and on. And to find, my first book was called A Sense of Wonder, and it was oral histories with Harlan Ellison, Theodore Sturgeon, Richard Matheson, Robert Bloch, and the Joker in the pack, Forrest J. Ackerman. And what I did was I went through their entire lives as an oral history, just a back and forth type of interview thing, up until the mid 70s. And that was supposed to be published by a company called Crown Publishing. And the manuscript went in, I was paid, and they went out of business. And they held the rights for a while, a long while. So bits and pieces of that anyway. But Harlan and I actually got a short story from Harlan for an anthology I edited in the mid 90s called The King is Dead, which was a collection of dead Elvis stories. In the mid 90s, there was all these weird sightings of Elvis being alive. And
he was the new Bigfoot.
Absolutely. And I called up a major publisher, Delacorte, and said, look, I'd like to do a high end anthology that mixes nonfiction and fiction pieces reflecting this. And it's going to be irreverent, but it's also going to be people like Greil Marcus, Roger Ebert, Joyce Carol Oates, Lou Reed, who I actually had to spend months getting through to before he trusted me. But then as soon as he found out that I had some of his privately published poetry pamphlets, he changed his mind. And he actually gave me an original essay, about Elvis Presley and what he thought about Elvis, which is interesting. So, Harlan did this thing called The Pale Silver Dollar of the Moon Pays Its Way and Makes Change. And at this point, we'd known each other for 20 years. And I said, hey, Harlan, I'm doing another anthology. At that point, I had already done 3. And he goes, what? And I told him. And I said, I'd love to have you contribute. And I said, just don't break my heart. And he laughed and he said, okay. And I swear to you, 2 weeks later, I got an original story from Harlan Ellison. And that was unprecedented. I still have people come up to me and say, how did you get Harlan Ellison? I said, I asked him, and
sometimes it's all it takes.
Yeah, well, but Harlan, he was notorious for being late and contentious, and Robert Bloch, who I mentioned, had a wonderful phrase for Harlan. They were close friends. He said that Harlan Ellison was the only organism he had ever met whose natural environment was hot water.
Hey, Paul, we've got some graphics here that John, T-shirted historian, is going to show.
Okay.
Yeah,
and
these are from my collection.
T-shirt.
Yeah. this one is a visual
I
effects
see.
illustration from Tom Cranham.
Yes, I see it. Yeah, I see it's the police headquarters in the Spinner, one of the early, yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the landing scene. That's wonderful that you have this.
I'm not. This, I guess, was not used in the film. This is Mentor Hubener's.
Yeah. This is the Cryo Chamber where Holden. It's the scene that was shot and then cut out.
Oh, it's in the work print. Yeah.
Yeah, it's in the work print, and it was actually it just didn't work. It kind of looks silly. And but basically what it was is that Holden did not die, and he was in this sort of like enclosed capsule with all these, you know, like I don't know, shunts and IVs into him and all that type of thing. And Deckard comes to ask him about what happened at you know, the Tyrell Corp when he was shot. And this is an illustration of that. But if you notice the cap that's being worn there. This was actually at a time when that look was for Dustin Hoffman. Dustin Hoffman was going to be dressed like that because Dustin Hoffman was, you know, the guy who, after going through many other people that they were looking to cast as Deckard, Dustin Hoffman was the first one that they looked like they were going to actually cast. And Dustin had that weird cap and that kind of workman-like uniform there that you see, and that changed.
I'm glad.
You can see shades of the Nostromo in that.
Yeah.
Of course, yeah.
And there's some of that. Oh God, what's the name of that house? That house that was done.
The Ennis Brown.
Ennis house, yes.
Right, yeah, the Frank Lloyd Wright thing, which I think one of the best ways to see the exterior of is that old Vincent Price movie, House on Haunted Hill.
Yes.
Oh yes.
It's in lots of disrepair right now. They're still working on it.
I know, and there's
and it's no longer called the Ennis Brown House.
No, I know that. Yeah, at the time they were shooting it, that's what they were calling it. Yeah, because it had different owners. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just in the last decade, I think it sold to just one owner, right? And so now it's, and I can't remember who it is.
I just hope that it, you know, continues to exist. I mean. Our species is so destructive, and it just, particularly in America, we bulldoze things after 2 weeks, you know, and it's really a marvelous architectural wonder, and one hopes that it remains. Yeah, here's a Sid Mead, and you know, one of the Metro cabs, people vehicle type of thing. And this is one of the ones that Gene Winfield actually created, but it was modified and it was made in a much simpler version. You know, a lot less detailing and, well, anyway.
But I know you say that it's simpler, but was it subjected to the same level of detail inside by Ridley as all the rest?
Yes and no. There were certain angles that you could see, you know, displays, you know, not really working. Hi, Mike. Yeah, the cryotubes room in Alien. Yes, there, and also if you notice on the ceiling, there's a bit of that lotus design that the cryotubes when they open up. Yeah, I know what you mean. That was for Mike Arthur. I just saw this little thing pop up.
Yeah, Mike is a mutual friend of Iain, Paul's, and mine. And he's
I know Mike through, we correspond, and Mike does marvelous work. You talk about a prop.
Yeah, he does. His design work for Blade Runner lighting and stuff. Woo!
Yes. Okay, and here we have, of course, an early, you know, Deckard bathroom. I think it is. It's a bit hard to see. But yeah, this is, I think, his bathroom. When they were first... Sid went kind of like his usual glossy, high-tech, you know, utopian type of future, because Sid was a utopian guy. He thought science would save us. And Ridley said, no, you know, it's got to be a mixture. And that's where the whole retrofitting thing came from. It was that Ridley said, let's take the new, but the old is still going to be there, so let's like mix them up. And you see that in Deckard's apartment as well, especially in the decorations. Deckard must make a lot of money because there's so much art in that apartment of his in Blade Runner. You know, everywhere you look, you know.
This one I think is pretty striking. It's a Sid Mead,
Oh yeah.
but this could be like downtown Kowloon right now.
Yeah.
And what you see there on the right is an early illustration of Sebastian's, what they call the Armadillo Van. And that was supposed to be Sebastian's mobile workshop. And originally, Pris was going to be discovered hiding inside the Armadillo Van. And she was going to be much more seductive. She was going to be dressed in something almost like a nightgown, which was wet. And he goes in being in a building and opens it up, and there's this beautiful young woman who's terrified. But that got changed, and then he, as you well know, he meets her, in the trash outside the Bradbury building. But yes, this is, if you'll notice in the background, you see this shot, you see the mega structures going up. That's very Sid Mead. That is a visual constant in a lot of his work. But you can already see the crossover here between the old and the new, and the Asian influence. Incidentally, the reason, for those of you who don't know, why there is such a Asian flavor in Blade Runner is because in the 80s, and even in the early 80s, Japan was one of the major economic forces in the world stage. And the Japanese were flush with cash, and they were buying up everything. And America was getting real estate bought by them, brand names bought by them. But the Japanese were a bit innocent. And unfortunately, they believed a lot of hustlers in America, and they put good money into bad things. And then that whole economic bubble in Japan popped right into the third year I was working in Japanese television, which was kind of annoying. But that whole period there, there are Chinese touches, but it's mostly a real world reflection of the Japanese economic dominance that was going on in the early and indeed throughout the 1980s.
Interestingly enough, that same theme continued, and it would color the future of a role-playing game that Grim and I are very familiar with, called Cyberpunk,
Right.
written by R. Talsorian Games, where one of the major villains is the Arasaka Corporation.
Now, this is ancient history, but one of my favorite video games is Arkham Asylum, the Batman one.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I love that one.
And you were talking about Pris earlier, and I do have a little production still. There's Sherman Lobby.
Right. This is the one when they're in the gymnasium, when they were originally going to have the fight in this decaying gym. And she just, as you can see, beats the crap out of him, as always. But interestingly enough, I'm sure you've seen the storyboard where she's actually hanging through the hoop of the basketball hoop.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was where she was supposed to die in that originally. And then that kept changing. Again, it was very hard to keep up with what was going on day by day. Sherman Labby and Minton Hubner, who did a lot of the pre-production and storyboard art, were both old pros. Mentor, had worked on Forbidden Planet, for instance. And, oh yeah, here we go. This is the the VK test, and with Leon and with Holden, and you can see on the lower right there. Do you see that beam of light? Mm-hmm. That was originally there was a thing called the black hole gun that was going to be Deckard's blaster, which was.
I wrote an entire article on Blade Zone about that gun.
Yeah, exactly. And it was something that they tried to do, but they just visually could not pull it off. One of the reasons being that it is very difficult in film to show, how can I put this? Graphically speaking, it's very difficult. It's one thing to be able to draw a sketch or a painting and have, say, a beam of black. But to show that on film, especially back then, and to do as an optical, it was just hard. And so there was a tiny bit of it that you can see in the shooting that happens in the film if you freeze frame it when the beam comes up that Leon shoots through the table, and it hits the thermos and the cup. If you freeze frame that, you will see a little blue flash. And that originally was meant to be sort of a prototype for the black hole gun, and they were moving towards the blue flash at that point. And it wasn't like a pyro effect. It was actually sort of a combination of a pyro and a visual, a VFX effect. And so, but it just didn't work. And so that's another interesting thing about the film is as they were shooting it, they were kind of changing things up, you know, and changing things around. So interesting.
This this last piece is probably my favorite one because it's really gorgeous.
Oh yeah.
The original VK, and you can see the Meade signature here.
Oh yeah, yes, the Voight Kampff machine. You know, that was to see that prop was just as fascinating as it is in the film. It actually was quite delicate. It was broken a couple of times because you know, when the stock rose up from the bulk of the body, and Deckard leans forward to push the little button that opens up the iris scanner. That thing, you know, you could blow on it and it could break. And as I recall, a couple of times just transferring it to the set, it kind of it didn't make it. But the bellows, of course, were, you know, meant to be. They were sampling the atmosphere. And it was a pheromone sniffer. So what was going on is they were, you know, obviously talking about fluctuations in the iris, but they were also doing things like measuring pheromones. There was a sort of a wireless lie detector, a galvanic skin response going on. And Ridley's mandate to Sid at this point was, he said, I want it menacing, but I want it delicate. And that's what he came up with. And, you know, it really is one of the iconic alternate science fiction universe mechanisms that has ever been put on film. Everyone who sees that VK thing goes, what the hell is that? You know?
Can I say, I'm a retired detective, and my particular bag was interrogative interview, both with, you know, like with victims and with the accused, and the VK scene informed the way that I started doing my interviews. And then I was lucky enough to meet a very intelligent man who works for the FBI now as a consultant, who changed the face of their interview techniques. And I was lucky enough to do some training with him in my own private time.
Right.
And he told me that his interest in that whole thing was inspired twofold: the filtering of memories from Blade Runner, but also the VK machine sparked his interest in how interrogations can be carried out and how you can set a baseline in them. So Blade Runner it shaped my professional life as well as my personal interest in the movie.
Well,
it's far richer.
You know, that's wonderful. It's also part of a string of pearls. There have been so many people who have pulled things out of that film, which have not only influenced them in terms of loving a movie, but I know architects. I know, literally, you name a profession, from people who have seen Blade Runner either in the 80s or the 90s. And one of the wonderful things about the film is that it keeps being an intergenerational gestation. It doesn't matter, you know, you would think a 40-year-old film is it's 40 next year, right? And you would think, okay, that's such ancient history, who cares? And yet I still have teenagers. I still have kids, not kids. I still have people in their 20s, 30s, you know, who just seen it. Say, oh my God, you know, there's so much in there. I go, yeah. And, you know, it is graphics, signage. And it's interesting that you talked about FBI work, because one of the things that personally resonated with me, and I don't know if I shared this in the book, but my father was in military intelligence, and he actually was kind of a covert CIA guy. I didn't even know he was in the CIA until after his death. But from 60 to 63, he had already been in the Navy for 20 years, and we had essentially grown up in Asia, in the Philippines, and which in the 50s and the 60s was about as third world as you can get. And he always was very good with not being xenophobic or any kind of phobic. And considering that he was the son of a coal miner who died of black lung when my dad was 11, he was an autodidact. He self-educated. In fact, at the end of his life, he joined Mensa, and they found out that his IQ was 160, and he had never had his IQ, done. This is all, yes, I love my dad, but the point being was that he then went into naval counterintelligence, and at that point, as I was growing up, that was our home life, and so the street atmosphere and vibe and crime and corruption subtext in Blade Runner, the decay and the entropy and the selfishness, the cruelty, the greed. I saw that firsthand at a very early age. And my wife says that when I was 10, I was going on 60. And I always say, well, in some ways, yes. But that's one of the things that's always appealed to me, is that in many ways it of course filters its observation through the prism of a Hollywood fantasy. But there are some very disturbing and truthful real world concerns about the precariousness of human society and the corruption that can tear it apart. And that's one of the things that's always appealed to me as well. I don't speak about it too often because mostly you want to talk about that visual tsunami, that incredible production design, or just the atmosphere or the music or the actors or the quirky weirdness of it all. But there are many, many subtexts to that film. In fact, the famous critic, Pauline Kael, one of my favorite quotes about Blade Runner, she didn't like it. She goes, Blade Runner is all subtext and no text. I always loved that one.
It's certainly influenced my own creative work, writing and game design and so on. And I think the main thing I've taken from it is to have more than one thing going on. To have that sort of philosophical underpinning. And even if people don't notice that you're tackling deeper subjects, it raises the overall quality.
I did an essay for a cyberpunk. It's called the Cyberpunk Nexus, which is a Blade Runner oriented series of art. Lou Tambone was the editor on that. It came out a couple of years ago, 3 years ago. And I did an introductory essay on that because if you'll notice in Future Noir, I never reviewed the film. But I finally had a chance to more or less approach some of these deeper themes in this opening introduction. And I called it The Drums of Doom, Blade Runner, Entropy, and the Death of Everything. And that's really my bottom line with it. Blade Runner is essentially about death. It's not about life. It's not about the struggle to stay alive, although it is about that, but it's essentially about oblivion. And I think, and I wrote about, and is now common knowledge, Ridley Scott's older brother, Frank, who he worshipped, had died not too long before they started shooting Blade Runner, and Ridley was devastated by that. And he jumped into working on the film partly as a form of therapy. And but I think the psychic
catharsis,
tragedy. No, I was going to say the psychic devastation that his brother Frank's passing gave him colored the entire film. I really do. I think that underneath it all is Ridley's loss, Ridley's sorrow. I think that's really what that foundation is on that movie. But that's
the thing I find interesting about it is it really is the story about a man who falls in love with a robot at the end of the world.
Yeah, and Harrison always thought it was sick. He always thought that Deckard was very perverted. That's what he used to read. No, he goes, if you read the latest version, and for those of you who are just joining us, I just happen to have a copy once again of this thing.
You get your copy at Amazon.com.
No, I want mine signed now.
Amazon, and you also can get it in Kindle, and it's 600 pages. So
four.
Yeah,
on the Kindle.
But Harrison finally. I've known Harry for years, but he, as famously until recently, he did not want to speak about Blade Runner because he had such a hard time making it. He and Ridley were tangling, and it was all kinds of. Anyway, Harrison did he was very gracious. He's a flyer, and unfortunately now he's known for a couple of crashes that happened. But what he's not known for is the fact that he's done a number of rescues in Montana, in Wyoming, and Idaho, where he has actually flown helicopters to pluck people.
Helicopter sorties. Yep.
Yeah, he's like, Harrison's done some good works that you don't hear about because it's more sexy to say, oh, this guy crashed and almost killed people on a golf course. Well, guess what? He landed on the golf course because the plane went out over downtown Santa Monica, and he whipped it around to hit a place that was open. And he knew that there was a good chance that he wouldn't make it, but his decision was to go down in a non-populated. Anyway, I really hate disinformation has become the norm. And that is not only politics and medicine and everything else, but it just, this fracturing of what is true and what is not true. I'll tell you, I had someone say to me recently, there is no one greater than me. My mind and my reality is the greatest thing I can think of. And I stared at them, and I'm in Florida at the moment. I said, I'll tell you what, why don't you go down to Daytona Beach during a lightning storm and hold up a 9-iron and see if there's a power greater than you.
I know, right?
And it's just maddening, and I get it because there are so many competing information streams and everything has become atomized and fractured and polarized, and I get it. But there are some essential truths, and without those, we are just doomed, I don't go to a doctor to get my transmission fixed, right? So, anyway. So Harrison, in that interview I was talking about, he flew in from, I couldn't believe it. He flew in from Jackson Hole to meet with me at the Santa Monica airport, where at the time he had an office. And he literally flew in just to talk to me. And I'm sitting there in this little conference room, and here he comes in. And he was tired, and he had just flown across country. He sat down, and we talked for 3 hours. And then we did follow-ups on the thing. And, he remembered me. He said, oh, yeah, you were the guy that was always around with the tape recorder. And I said, oh, yeah. And he was aware of the book. And, was still, I think Harrison's problem is that he is a working professional who is someone who it's all about the part and it's all about the career. He's obviously a careerist, but he is more interested in actually acting. And he has a range, and yet he's got like people that know him as Indiana Jones, people that know him as Han Solo, people that know him as Rick Deckard. Well, but they don't remember his little bit part in The Conversation, where he plays a really frightening assistant to Robert Duvall in that. They forget that he was in Apocalypse Now as kind of this nerdy lieutenant who
Lieutenant Lucas.
Yes, exactly. Who or in American Graffiti, or the countless bonanzas and Have Guns Will Travel and Big Valleys when he was third cowboy from the left who always got shot 10 minutes into the show. I mean,
yeah, he did. He also referred to it as doing shows where I wasn't the person who did it.
yeah. So Harry's been through it all, and yet he's and let me say something about what I was trying to get to, and then I'll say something more about Harrison Ford. Was that when we were talking about, like everyone talks about, oh, you're in this film, blah 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 blah. So few people have asked you what was your backstory? Because good actors will build within themselves a history of the character. Sometimes it's given to them by the director, but the way it usually works is a professional is cast and hired with the understanding that they're going to bring a lot to the table themselves, and part of that is prep. Who is this character that's on the page that I now have to make real? And Harrison said that he was burnout, possibly an alcoholic, isolationist, and essentially has fallen in love with a machine or a device. And I stared at him. I said, so in other words, damaged goods. And Harry goes, very. So that was his take on Deckard.
I think it's pretty accurate.
Yeah. And Harrison's a no bullshit kind of guy. He's a very straightforward man. But
I'm gonna.
I will end my Harrison Ford screed right here.
Okay.
One of the things that very few people know about Harrison is how literary he is. He has read everything. There's an old line that Ridley Scott uses where he says, if you're in a room with a bunch of people and Harrison Ford walks in, he is the smartest man in the room. And that is not Hollywood puffery. It's true. Harrison is incredibly articulate, incredibly sharp, and incredibly well read. And in fact, when he was in his Carpenter phase, he did a library that he made for Joan Didion and John Donne, the very famous writing couple, who are considered to be, at the time, they were like serious literature purveyors. And Harrison told me he would be sitting there, doing this custom library for them. And then they would say, well, do you want to stay and have a glass of wine? And he was so overwhelmed by their brilliance that he said, I would just sit in a corner and listen. And here come Truman Capote, or here would come in Gore Vidal, or, and I just went,
Whoa.
So there's much, as with Blade Runner, there is much more to Harrison Ford than meets the eye.
Well, you know that Gerry and I from Blade Zone never wanted to interview him. We were terrified of him.
Oh, don't be. He's a nice guy. You know what?
Like,
all you have to do is be authentic. Don't be geeky. Don't go up and want to count the buttons on Han's, tunic. Just approach him as a professional and as someone who has this rich body of work, and talk about the work, and you'd be amazed. And he's got very good radar, as many of these people do. I think one of the reasons why he was so forthcoming with me, and again, this sounds self-congratulatory, but I had no agenda other than to say, hey, I really liked your performance. And I really think that was one of your better performances. And I am very familiar with your career. So let's talk. And, on that level, once he got past, I mean, if you read the interview in the latest version of Future Noir, it's hilarious because it takes about, a third of the way into the interview, which is roughly 10 to 15,000 words, where he finally starts to thaw. And he finally stops with the monosyllabic answers and the rote stuff. And he starts to realize that there's actually a dialogue going on. And there's not a journalist there who's cynical and seen and done it all and doesn't give a crap and is going to move on to the next celebrity interview. He realized there's someone that was engaged with him. And as soon as you can see it as you read it. And the responses get longer, they get more thoughtful, they get more perceptive. And so, when you're a major international celebrity, there's a lot you have to watch out for. So.
Oh, yeah. Now, I'm going to take this in a new direction. Before I do, though, Six, can you share that screen? There we go. There's the article I wrote. You can scroll down about black hole weapons. And yes. I describe what a black hole weapon is, what it would do, because I've always been a tech guy, always into the science of the sci-fi. And so I wrote that long article. I also wrote about the AI used in Blade Runner.
Oh, I lost you there.
Because, a lot of people weren't aware.
Okay, I'm sorry.
What's that?
You were dropping in and out, but that's okay. Go ahead.
Okay, well, anyway, basically, I talked about the black hole weapon here, and I talked about, the artificial intelligence that was used in Blade Runner, from like little things that just go by really quickly and people don't notice. Like when the cop walks towards the spinner in the Deckard scene, he just touches the front end of the car and the door opens.
Yes.
He didn't hit a button. He was just, it was the artificial intelligence of the vehicle knowing to open that door.
And also when Deckard goes into his apartment, and this is very early in the game,
The lights.
notice the lighting follows him and turns on and off.
Yep.
You know, so it's doing body heat. And, you know, it's interesting you brought up AI because from Alien on, Ridley Scott has over and again returned to the threat of artificial intelligence. And it's become overt with David in, you know, in Prometheus and Covenant. And, but he's always been frightened of AI. Now, we talked about it, the singularity. I'm sure you know what that is. You know, and he's quite concerned. And I wouldn't say I'm concerned, but on the other hand, I wouldn't say I'm cynical, but I'm a realist. And if you let a genie out of a bottle, it's very hard to put it back in.
Yep.
Oh, I agree with that one, truly.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Tim, do you want to lead us into the next subject, which I promised would come up?
Oh, yeah.
Hi, Tim.
Hey, how's it going? Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So he kind of Paul messed with my answer a little bit because he changed my perspective as far as like the underlying message of the movie or what it's about. I never even thought about that, so that may affect my answer a little bit. But yeah, is Deckard a replicant? That's the big question we're all wondering here.
Paul can't answer that definitively. It'll be an opinion.
Yeah.
I can tell you, as someone who was there in literally 2 days after Ridley Scott was hired in prep and read all of the different drafts of the script, was there through the entire principal photography phase, was there doing post phase and the shooting of the miniatures and the mixing and the Foley and all that, saw the first cuts, saw the one down in San Diego preview, got I can't say how, but I got to see the work print, the one that they showed in Denver and Dallas at the sneak previews. What happened with that was this. Early on, and this is a direct quote from Ridley, he was talking about the analog of surgeons when you go through medical school, or any doctor, and you're starting, and this, by the way, I have a degree in psychology, and the same thing happened to me, but it's ancient history. I might as well have a degree in cave painting. He was talking about how there is a common phenomenon as you're learning about different pathologies, that you begin to think that you have the disease yourself or you have something wrong with you. And so he said, wouldn't it be interesting if this man who is pursuing these rogue replicants starts to wonder if he himself is human? Now, you heard the way that was put, starts to wonder. So
that's even in the book.
That's in the book.
He originally wanted no. In Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, Phil, I knew Phil Dick, and Phil and I talked about that. He goes, no, he's not a replicant. The replicants play a mind game on him at one point.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. He begins the question.
Right. Well, they in the book, Deckard winds up in a phony police station that's filled with replicants, and they basically try to convince him he's one, but he's not. He's human.
Yeah.
In the film, he started in prep as someone who may or may not be a replicant, but essentially is questioning his own humanity. As it progressed, and the screenplay was gestating, Harrison was finally came aboard, and he goes, and this is famous, he goes, well, look, he says, I can't really see the audience having any kind of empathic connection with me as a character if I am portrayed as someone who's ultimately revealed to be an artificial human. Where is the arc? Where is the emotional tether that from one human to the other? And Ridley said, okay, we'll shoot it that way. But then as the shooting progressed, Ridley has had a unicorn fascination and fixation his entire life. It doesn't it didn't first start with Blade Runner or Legend, the subsequent film. I was fortunate enough at one point to be able to go into Ridley Scott's archives, which are in a unbelievable complex that is literally temperature controlled. You have to wear a coat and you have to put white gloves on, and they're in these stainless, it's like so high tech, it's unbelievable. And I saw some of Ridley's artwork from when he was a child. Ridley's been drawing. I saw something he did when he was 12 years old of a human skull that looked like Da Vinci had done it. So Ridley is extremely talented, but he's always had a thing about fairy tales and unicorns. And so as the filming progressed, this unicorn idea started to gestate in his mind. And at first it was kind of like obvious that it was kind of gaff, like leaving these kind of like sarcastic origami sculptures that were commenting on whatever sequence it was in. And in the original theatrical cut, the only reason why that tinfoil unicorn is there, because there is no unicorn dream in the first one, the theatrical cut, was just to indicate that Gaff had been there and left his calling card and let Rachel live. End of story. So in that thing, he's not a replicant. He's human. Okay? But as the thing progressed in filming, Ridley started to lean more towards the idea that he is a replicant. Where Harrison went, no, I'm not a replicant. And it got to be a very kind of heated thing. In fact, being there when it happened is a funny story. When they shot the sequence where he picks up the tinfoil unicorn, he looks at it, and there's this wonderful moment when he goes, and they go, cut, throws it down, he goes, God damn it, you're trying to suggest I'm a replicant again. It's true. So, and Ridley has come out and saying, yes, he's a replicant, and Harrison says, no, I'm not a replicant. But honestly, the way it evolved and where it started and where it ended, I think one of the marvelous things about ambiguity is that ambiguity is endlessly fascinating. Certainty never is. And so I think that's one of the wonderful things about Blade Runner, is that it was so tangled from the beginning to the end. You can come down on either side of it. But as I said, in Dangerous Days, that wonderful documentary on Blade Runner that Charlie de Lauzirika did, and shout out to Charlie. Charlie got that final cut together and finally got us the version that Ridley always wanted.
And I want to get him on here, by the way. I've known him for 25 years, and I can't get him to respond to come on the show. I can get him to respond about anything.
Well,
but getting him on the show.
I can't speak to that. I like Charlie, and I've known him for a long time too. But who knows? What I was going to say is that in Dangerous Days, there is, the deckard ? Section. And I said, in all honesty, you can have an opinion, but I think the only ultimate answer to the question of whether Deckard is a replicant, other than which version of the film you see, is maybe.
Well, it comes up in our groups all the time, and it's one of the questions that I absolutely forbid people trying to ram their opinions down other people's throats. One of our big rules is courtesy and respect. And what we always say is,
good luck.
Trust me, it works. Anybody acts up, anybody gets rude, you're out.
I'm sorry.
The irony of that, Iain, is that you're Scottish.
I hear you, Iain, and I did not mean to be disrespectful, but I'm Irish. I'm basically smart.
But what we all say is, it's whatever works for you, whatever you believe in, whichever print is your favorite, then that's what Deckard is.
Hey, Paul, we have a super sticker from Zach7, a good friend of ours.
I see
$5 super chat. Mr. Sammon, what is your preferred cut of Blade Runner and why?
Well, for many years, it was the work print, and that was unseeable until they did the suitcase version. in 2007 for the 25th anniversary of Blade Runner, where the work print is actually included in the discs. And I did a commentary for that. And the reason why was because tonally it's so different. And there are shots in that never showed up in the final cut. And because of the fact that it was hadn't been color timed and completely massaged at the time when I saw it, and when indeed it was shown at the premieres, the sneak previews, it had a whole different vibe to it. It didn't have a voiceover. It had one little bit at the very end when Batty is expiring on the rooftop, where Deckard says, "I watched him die all night. It was long, it was slow, and he fought all the way." And that's it. That's the only voiceover. And it comes at such a powerful moment. So for many years, that was my favorite. I hated the theatrical cut. Absolutely despised it. I despised the voiceover. I thought it was a real second-rate piece of work. I'm not the only one. Harrison certainly felt that way. And to clear something up, Harrison did not sabotage by having that flat. He did not. He's too much of a pro to try to do that kind of thing. He did as he was directed with what he was given. So that is another one of these rumors that have been out there forever, that Harrison Ford, intentionally tried to sink the film through that narration. Untrue. The other thing is, waiting until 2007 and having seen the director's cut, having seen the work print in 70 millimeter again when it kind of popped up in 1990 in the Fairfax Theater at this celebration of 70 millimeter films, and suddenly they realized they have the work print as opposed to the theatrical cut. Anyway, going through the various iterations, when the final cut finally came out, I of course had seen. You have to remember that being embedded, as it were, and being one of the first people to be embedded in a production like that, I was very good friends with Terry Rawlings, the editor, who unfortunately is no longer with us. And Terry was a terrific guy. Huge film fan, huge soundtrack fan, had thousands of soundtracks. He and I hit it off. And he had a moviola, and occasionally he would say, "Come on in," and he would run scenes for me. And so I saw things that did not pop up again until the final cut. And when the final cut came in, there were a few aesthetic decisions, but they all came from Ridley. About, for instance, when you're pushing in on the Tyrell pyramids at the very beginning, that's actually been lightened up. The lighting on that has been brought up a bit from the original prints, and so you can see more detail. It almost looks like it's more of a dusky kind of thing as opposed to night, which it's supposed to be. But for the most part, that is the one now that I think is definitive. So that is my favorite. Yeah, the final cut is my favorite.
I have to say, I miss Rutger Hauer a lot, because he was a hell of a talent beyond this film. But in this film, he's just he's so tremendous. I mean, he didn't realize what kind of lightning in a bottle he really was to cinema until this film, especially that final scene. And I cry every single time I see it.
Believe me, there were people crying behind the scenes. That was a hell of a. It was like almost 36 hours that people were awake when they shot that. That was nightmarish. That if you look at I think David Snyder on Jermaine's website, I'm not sure, he actually put the call sheet on there where it says no breaks all night.
Because they broke it down after they shot that scene.
Yeah, and well, what they actually did was, if you'll notice, when Gaff Spinner comes up behind Roy when he's dead, the sky is blue. It's turning blue. That was dawn coming up. And so they got cut. They turned off the rain machines, smoke pots, all this kind of stuff. The Warner's execs, one of them, walks up and says, "That's it. You're done. Off the lot." And Ridley waited until they were gone and said, "We're going to move this thing inside a soundstage and keep shooting. And we're going to make sure they don't know it." And one of the people who were in construction said, "How are you going to do that? It's too tall." He says, "We're going to chainsaw part of it," which they did. They lowered it. They put it on wheels. They stuck it in an empty sound stage. They locked the doors, and they continued shooting. And the studio didn't even know. I love that story. It was just wonderful. That, you know, and that was Ridley. And you know, some people are born with their mouths hungry, and it takes a certain type of psychology, an individual drive, and also just a passion to put up with the millions of just cuts and insults and cruelties and setbacks, and it's a very rough business. And Ridley has never stopped moving forward, and I gained such respect for him on that. I mean, we hit it off right away. I never had a problem with Ridley, and it was odd because when I first met him, as I think I mentioned earlier, he had just been hired, and it was at the old Brighton production offices, which was in Gower Gulch, this old studio. And I remember walking up, and Michael Dealey and I had a talk to the producer, and he goes, "Oh, we got our director here finally. It's Ridley. He just got in. You want to go talk to him?" I go, "Sure." And I sat in, and he introduced me, and he kind of like, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well," I said, "you know, it looks like I'm writing for a mainstream magazine called Omni, which was the science magazine sister to Penthouse." And
I remember that.
Yeah, I still have the issues of it.
It's actually featured in the movie as Monty.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And but I was also doing, you know, as people who are aware of this old magazine called Cinefantastique, which, by the way, is coming back. It's
coming
good.
It is? I heard
And
they
it's
would
coming
shut it
back as a
down.
print version. Yes, and I think they're going to be reprinting something I did on Dune, but we'll see, because I did a cover story on Dune for them in 1984. But it is coming back, so something to look forward to. Anyway, I said, but I think what it looks like, I said, and by the way, I've worked for Disney in the publicity department. I was on the Black Hole. I said, I was just with Universal on Conan the Barbarian. You know, he goes, "Oh, you're one of us." And I go, "Yeah." And he goes, "Are you a publicist?" And I go, "I don't know what I am." I said, "I'm basically this, I've made my own niche right now." I said, "But I know your work." And he looks at me and goes, "Yeah, Alien?" I go, "No, The Duelist." And he smiles. He goes, "Where was it?" I said, "It was the Royal Theater in Santa Monica." And he just laughed because I was the only person there.
I have a copy of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great
what
movie.
A debut.
It's like my number 5 favorite film of all time.
And it was done like for 50 cents, you know, which is amazing. You know, Albert Finney is in that. You remember? In The Duelist, he has like a kind of a walk-on with all bushy and all that kind of stuff. He did that for a case of champagne.
What's amazing is that Ridley made a better film than Kubrick did with Barry Lyndon.
I love Barry Lyndon. I hated it when
I
it
do
first
too.
came out.
But
I
The Duelist is a better story, and it's shot just as beautifully.
Oh,
True.
yeah. And, oh, well, Ridley, you know, the man with the golden eye. I mean, you know, another thing he told me, because I'm a photographer as well, a professional, and I belonged, in fact, to the local 600, which is the Still Photographers Union, the International Cinematographers Guild for some time. And I used to shoot sets as well. I've done all kinds of weird shit. And, you know, Ridley and I were talking about photography once, and I said, you know, I mean, obviously you were born with a certain talent. I said, but your lighting. And he goes, "You know what I do?" I go, "What?" He goes, "Every day I take, whenever I have a moment, and I do have my moments when I have a quiet moment, whether I'm on a car to a set or I'm sitting at home," which he's rarely at, or, you know, whatever. He goes, "I'll just look and see how the light is working in the real world." And that's his baseline. I mean, yes, he's familiar with all the fine artists. He's familiar with contemporary art. I mean, he's very well versed in the art world. But basically, he looks at the real world, and what does it look like in the morning? What does it look like lighting in the afternoon? What does it look like when it's overcast? What does it look like here in the forest? What does it look like here in the swamp? And he puts that in there, and then it comes out here. It's fascinating, man. He really is a fascinating guy.
Can I ask two questions, Paul? The first is about Ridley. One of our members, Vincent Noto, he's an academic in one of our groups. He wrote a paper linking the works of Joseph Losey to Ridley Scott.
Yeah, is he the author of that?
Yes, he is.
I've read that.
It changed the way I looked.
The mirror from the servant.
It's superb. I mean, it's so informative. It really is a fantastic piece of work. So I just wanted to check. Did Ridley ever mention this influence that Joseph Losey?
No.
Okay.
Overtly? I will repeat. No.
Okay. Because the unicorn features there very heavily as well.
To answer your question, and by the way, a shout out to that piece. I have read it. One of the reasons I suppose I can keep current with what's going on in the Blade Runner universe is I'm an omnivorous reader. I always have been. I will literally read the toilet paper packages. I'm tearing it apart. I just can't help myself. But I've kept up. Sometimes I'm just like a lurker on a lot of the sites because I don't want to be known that I'm doing it. Because then you get well-meaning inquiries, but you get overwhelmed and you can't answer everyone, and people's feelings get hurt, and I don't want to do that. But I did read that, and I thought, oh, spot on, because Ridley is a hardcore movie buff, hardcore from the time he was a child. I asked him, I said, what always surprised me when I first got into the business in the late 70s were how few people who worked in the film business knew anything about film. They knew about the movies they'd worked on or what was au courant. But if you talk 10 years, 15 years, 20, if you talk film history, what are you talking about? And Ridley said, oh, no, man. He said, I used to go when I was up in Stockton and Tees, which I visited, by the way, in 2019. I saw Ridley's home, his old home. He'll think I'm a stalker, but it wasn't me. The guys who were sort of like managing me said, "Hey, we know where Ridley's family used to live," and I said, "Okay." Anyway, but Ridley said that when he was a boy, he used to go to the movies all the time and kick the back of the seats along with everybody else and throw popcorn at the screen, and he still watches. I mean, there is a thing called The Awakening that Rebecca Hall was in, which is a very good Victorian ghost story. And Daniel, what's his name? He's now a pretty well-known composer for films. But he did The Counselor. Daniel Pemberton did the soundtrack for The Counselor. And I said, hey, Pemberton, the only thing I remember him from is The Awakening. And The Awakening is a pretty obscure film. And Ridley goes, yeah, wasn't that score great? How about Rebecca Hall in that haunted dollhouse? And I went, oh, man, and so he keeps up. He literally sees everything. So to get back to the Joseph Losey influence, Losey, of course, was an expat who had fallen under the hammer of the blacklist in the 50s, relocated to England, and started a second career with such talent as Harold Pinter and a serious and internationally renowned filmmaker. And The Servant is one of his best films. But visually speaking, there are shots where you can go, oh, Now, again, overtly, Ridley has never said that. Subconsciously, I don't think anyone who is into the arts and does it either professionally or as a passionate hobby would disagree that essentially you have so much influence in you that sometimes you forget, you think you have an original idea, and you're actually recycling through your own psyche something you've seen, heard, or read about before. And sometimes it's intentional. Sometimes you're just stealing, But I think in terms of that, it is interesting that there are I wouldn't say a great deal, but there are some very specific props and shots in The Servant. that are very similar to setups in Blade Runner.
Thank you for that.
Well, I want to point out. Oh yeah, because we got to wrap up.
Yeah. So
All
just one last one. Jermaine would never forgive me if I didn't ask you. What was it like meeting with Jordan Crone?
Jordan was a wonderful guy. Everyone liked Jordan. As probably is well known, he was very ill. He became more unhealthy as it went on. He's very kind. He's very patient. He had a son with him, who is a cinematographer himself.
He's an amazing cinematographer too.
Unbelievable, and I'd seen Cutter and Bone, or Cutter's Way as it's called. And that's the one I talked about with him, although Jordan, of course, had shot other films, before that. But Jordan was very patient. But I think what happened was that Ridley, well, it's a famous story. Ridley, here's another story. You know that 90% of Alien was shot by Ridley Scott?
Not surprised.
I mean, literally with the camera on his shoulder or, behind him.
I am not surprised.
Derek gets, rightly does get a DP credit. But really, when you get right down to it, Ridley Scott literally shot most of Alien himself. And he had done hundreds, if not thousands, of commercials before that. And here he comes to Hollywood, and he runs into this iron wall of all these unions. And it's like the famous thing he says, they wouldn't allow me to even look through the camera some of the times. And that's so illogical. It's like taking golf clubs away from Arnold Palmer. And he was terribly frustrated by that. Also, there was this huge backlash by the American crew because they knew Alien, but they had no idea that Ridley had done anything but Alien, and that he had like all this experience behind him, and as talented as he was, and he was so decisive, and he would say things, and he was so used to in England, just, okay, this is what we're going to do. And they say, right, Governor, they do it. He had to fight for every single minute of Blade Runner over and over and over. And he started very even-tempered the first week or so. He wasn't like that after about the third or fourth week. He was so frustrated. And a lot of the crew, including members, and I won't say who, on the camera crew, Jordan's crew, were really, really pushing back against Ridley. And it was really bizarre to see. Because the guy was so, it's not like he was trying to turn it into this massive ego trip. I can do it better than you and all the shit. He had done it all. Yeah. He'd done it all many times. And Jordan and he had a certain understanding because their visual aesthetic linked. Because if you've seen Jordan's work, you see that marvelous lighting and the real attention to light and shadow. And, Jordan had done films already that had a very neo-noir kind of look to them. And so it was a wonderful fit. But personally speaking, everyone loved him. But it was sad because he just became more and more ill. When they were shooting the scenes inside Chu's laboratory in that ice house, they had these lights that the gases were all collecting in, and it was an enclosed area with very little ventilation. We're all getting sick. But Jordan literally had to leave because he was getting really sick. And so I forget if it was his son that was actually not setting up, but actually doing some of the work there. But a wonderful guy. And, it was sad to see his decline. But I mean that, just a genuinely nice guy, And I'm as I said, I'm a photographer and also a lifelong film buff. I mean, I've fucking seen everything, and that's no lie. I see it all. I see it all from things on Netflix like Black Summer, which is that great 2-season. Has anybody seen that? That zombie show? I love that show. It takes about 3 episodes to get going, but that's what The Walking Dead should have been. A while ago. Yeah,
I agree with you on that.
But I also will sit down and I'm watching a movie that's very obscure right now that I saw in 1968 called Coming Apart with Rip Torn, which was an experimental film about a psychiatrist who puts a black and white camera behind a mirror in his office, a 2-way mirror. And the entire film is this fixed camera as he seduces his female patients, one after another. And, you know, so I've seen everything from Bela Tarr to Bela Lugosi, you know. And so for me to be involved with these first-rate talents was just, it was overwhelming. But I must say that Blade Runner, in a sense, in the summer of 1982 was probably the pinnacle of my innocence in terms of understanding the true dynamic of the film business and what really goes on, which we haven't spoken about, the cruelty and the avarice. But you know, it's a very fascinating industry, but it's an industry that for one brief moment allowed, in the early 80s, a man to do a $29 million art film, whether he calls it that or not, because he still shies away from that, but it is an art film. And to do it in such an impactful, personal, and graphically and philosophically and narratively striking way that 40 years later, we are still seeing its influence.
Amen to that. Paul, I really want to thank you for coming. I want to thank my panel, who's been amazing. We have so many more questions that we want to ask you, but we've gone past our normal time. And therefore, I have to say we have to have you back for a part 2.
Sure, no problem.
And
work out.
And I'm very blessed to have you as a friend. So I can bug you pretty much anytime, and you always respond.
Absolutely, no problem.
But
and listen, it was nice talking to you, Ian. And,
stick around, Paul.
Okay, and everyone else, you know, preferred cut of Blade Runner and why? Again, you know, the final cut, because it's what Ridley Scott wanted.
Amen to that. Now, for Zax, who gave us that California or Canadian $5, there's this little video.
He say you Blade Runner.
Tell him I'm eating.
There you go. Thanks again for the super chat. Now, I'm going to tell you right now that this is going to be a regular thing because I feel that I left my Blade Runner roots too far behind doing Pop Culture Minefield.
Right.
So I definitely would like to do more shows. I'd even enjoy at some point you joining the panel and us getting some other people from Blade Runner to join the show. And
if possible, you know, everyone's personalities are different, and some people's schedules are still even this far along.
It's it is, and that's why I'm so flexible with people. Like even this show, I was willing to bump it any hour that you wanted it. I was glad you took 6 o'clock because I knew that Iain was going to be pushing the envelope because it must be 2 o'clock in the morning there right now in Scotland.
He still looks pretty awake to me.
Yeah, he's a night owl, so like most of us.
So am I.
But Paul, you are such an awesome presence in my life. If it weren't for you, I would have never created Blade Zone. I wouldn't have.
Thank you, Gerry.
Reading your book inspired me, and I deeply appreciate having you in my life. I know Gerry feels the same way. I know all 3 of us that worked on Blade Zone named Gerry. What are the odds of that?
I know the 3 Garys.
Well, thank you. I pray I get to speak to you again. Thank you.
And thank you for everyone else that was here. And you know,
yes,
I appreciate it.
Thank you. We have an awesome chat.
Love to come back.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to play us out and then just stick around after our little outro here.
One last thing.
What is that, sir?
Have a better one.
Have a better one.
Have a better one.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys. And we'll get out of here.
Goodbye, Chocolate Mousse. I'll never forget you. Goodbye, Ducroix. Take care of yourself. Goodbye, Deja Vu. I'll always remember you. And I'll miss you most of all, Scarecrow.